All right, good to see everybody this morning. We have a great number in spite of the fact that we're missing a lot of ladies this morning. This is the weekend of the ladies' retreat, and there's 30-plus women up in Pigeon Forge. I've tried to keep up with the police reports all weekend long. It is something. When they make headline news, you know it's a raucous ladies' retreat. But I think they've had a great time. They always do. And I know that some couldn't make it this year, but I think next year, if you're capable, you should try, because if you're a lady that hasn't made it up there yet, they always come back really encouraged from that. All right, let's be turning our Bibles to 3 John. We get to start in verse 5 this morning of 3 John. We took a look at the first 4 verses last week. We introduced the book. We talked about Gaius, and then we talked about God's formula for success, which in verse 2 is that your soul is prospering. That's the most important thing. That is the main thing. And then as the soul prospers, then you can add financial prosperity along with that, and then you can also add physical prosperity along with that. But that the physical and financial should not be the way that we try to measure our spiritual success. It should be just the opposite of that. Spiritual success first, and then as a result of spiritual growth and spiritual faithfulness, then financial maturity and physical health come along with that. Because then you know what to do with them. We know how to handle those things. Today, we're going to cover verses 5 through 8. And if we have time, we might just get into a little of verse 9 where we talk about Diotrephes and we introduce him. So in the notes, this is question number 3. I want to read the question, and then I want to read the section, and then we'll open it up for some discussion and then follow with some ideas. All right, here's the question. Question number 3. In contrast to 2 John, what was Gaius able to do for some of the people? That's in verses 5 through 8. How should we treat laborers in the gospel? Are laborers sometimes mistreated, and how, if they are? What is the reward for participating with preachers of truth? Now here comes the section, verse 5. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. What do you think about that? What was Gaius doing? Do you remember in 2 John where John said, if somebody comes to you and they do not bring this doctrine, what was the lady told not to do? Don't bring them into your house. Don't bid them Godspeed. You don't well wish them. You don't send them on their way with praise. And she was not capable of doing that because they were bringing the doctrine that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh, and they were denying other parts of the doctrine. She was not capable. But Gaius, in contrast, was able to do something. What was he capable of doing? Yeah, he was able to help them, bring them on their way, send them on their way well. It's a great contrast to what happened in 2 John. So he starts in verse 5, and he says, beloved, which is that tender term of affection that he's been using all the way back since the beginning of 1 John. He said, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers. Now, there is some variance in how we take this phraseology of the brethren and for strangers. But first of all, he says, whatever you're doing faithfully for them. And the word here means it is a faithful or a good work, which he emphasizes at the end. Again, there's some debate about the identification of the groups here, and I'll give you my 2 cents on this. At the very least, when he says, what you do for the brethren, at the very least, what do we know about these people? They're Christians. They're believers. They're members of the Lord's church because they are brethren. And you don't get to become a brethren or a sisterin in Christ, right? You don't get to do that unless you're a member of the church. So you've got to obey the gospel. These are folks that have heard and believed and repented and confessed. They've been baptized. They've been added by the Lord to the church. We know that for a fact. The other part is, who are the strangers? He says, and for strangers. Some take this to mean non-members of the church, as if it's a contrast. So the idea would be what you do for Christians and for non-Christians. Does that seem to you like that's what he's talking about in context? I don't think that's what he's talking about in context. What do you think?
So this is just for thought. The ESV reads that a little bit differently in that it is the faithful thing you do for all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are.
Okay, and I think that's the key. I think it's a translational issue. I'm reading New King James, but if you have King James, New King James, you might have like a superscript, some sort of a marginal translation that's going to offer a little bit different sense. And I think the little bit different sense is the key to understanding who these people are. The whole point of what John is saying is commending, right, to sort of celebrating Gaius' treatment of faithful people. So I don't think here that he's talking about non-Christians. Now, as an aside, can you be benevolent toward non-Christians? Absolutely, you can be benevolent. There are some who over the years have said the church can only offer benevolent help to Christians only and never to non-Christians. And they've separated and caused division in doing that. That's not right, because the Bible is clear that we can do benevolence toward non-Christians. As a matter of fact, when we do benevolence for a non-Christian, what's the aim or the purpose of benevolence for a non-Christian? Yeah, to help them become Christians. It's open up the doors, and that is exactly what Acts 2:47 is. When it says, having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily those that are being saved. The favor there literally means the grace. That's benevolence. They showed benevolence toward people in the community. The result was God added to the church those who were being saved. God was saving the people who were submitting to the gospel plan of salvation. So you can open doors of opportunity. That's not what John is talking about here. Literally, the translation, like Ellis said, would be something like, especially those who are strangers. You do well, you do really good, a good work when you treat brethren well, especially people that you didn't know very well. Brethren that you may have never met before. So it seems to me that this is the same group of people, but John is just simply describing the kind of brethren that he had been introduced to. And if I can paraphrase it, it would sound something like what Ellis read, which is what you do for brethren, especially those that you don't know. Right? So if John sent a group to go and be with the congregation, and if Joel brought out last week that one of the Gaiuses mentioned in the New Testament was from Corinth, according to 1 Corinthians 1, Acts chapter 17 and 18, it's possible that this is the Corinthian congregation. Maybe, may not be. But maybe John was somewhere and dispatched a group of folks to go and meet with the folks in that congregation. And Gaius had never met those folks. And he's saying, what you did for brethren, those especially you'd never even met before, but maybe just based on my recommendation or based on the reputation they had that preceded them, what you did for them was a good thing. I think that's what he's saying here. What you did for them is a faithful work, like the ones that I sent to you. And I believe that to be the correct understanding, because in verse 6 he says, who would the who there be? The people that John sent, those brethren, especially those that Gaius didn't really know that well, who bore witness of your love before the church. So they came back and gave a report that Gaius was doing this for faithful workers in the church. Now he says they gave witness before the church, and I have no idea where Gaius is at. I really don't. I also have no idea where John is at. But there is a long-standing tradition that John ended up, do you know at which congregation? A guess? It is Ephesus. There's a long-standing tradition, don't know it for a fact, that John spent the latter portion of his life as a member of the church in Ephesus. And it almost makes sense if that was the case, because when he wrote the Revelation, the very first congregation that he addresses would be the Ephesian congregation. So I don't know if that's the case. It's just a tradition, but it could be that he's talking about Ephesus here. We don't know that for certain. However, what we do know is it's before the church. What do you think that means, before the church? What could that mean? He gave a report. Do sometimes congregations have missionaries in, and during the assembly hour have missionaries speak to the assembly? Here's your Bible authority for that right here. This is a missions report to the assembly. So it is a good thing for congregations to be well aware of the things that they're involved in. And when you bring people in and you say, you're helping support our work, here's a missions report on that. That's what was happening when John sent people to Gaius. They were well received by him. They brought back testimony of what was happening in the church, including the nefarious acts of Diotrephes, but they gave a missions report to the church. And I think here it just means to the assembly. They were at the assembly, perhaps in Ephesus, and that's what happened. So, John commends their faithfulness further. He says in verse 6, if you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well. That is, if you send them off in a worthy manner, you will do well. And there's a reason for that. He follows it immediately in verses 7 and 8. He says, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles, we therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. And the reason is because they were going forth in the name of Christ. And so that's a good thing when you're helping out workers. We're going to emphasize practically, we're going to emphasize that in just a moment. But he says that they are doing this for the sake of truth, for his name's sake. In verse 7 even says that they went forth for his name's sake. What does it mean to go forth for the name's sake? Okay, in the name of Christ. I want you to do this. Hold your place here. Go back with me to the book of Acts real quick, to chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. There's really two reasons why John says, if you help brethren, even people that you don't know well, but they're speaking the truth, and you help brethren who are preaching the truth, they're doing the work for the Lord. They're missionaries, they're preachers, whatever they might be, but they're faithful workers for God. One is they're doing it for his name's sake. That's the first reason. He's going to give a second reason in just a moment, but he said the first is for the name's sake. All right, Acts chapter 5. And Peter and John have been preaching along with the rest of the apostles, and they have been charged a number of times with not preaching the truth anymore. Remember the story? They healed the man at the beautiful gate. He was lame. He'd been lame since the time he was born. And they have him get up and walk, and he's leaping and praising God. And, of course, the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, can't stand it. And they tell Peter and John, don't you dare preach that message anymore. Don't you dare do that stuff anymore. You're taking glory away from us. And they charge them. And then they said, we cannot help but speak the things that we've seen and heard. And then they call them on the carpet, and they do the same thing again. And that's where you get in verse 29 where Peter says we ought to obey God rather than men. We're not going to stop doing this. We'll drop down to verse 41. So they departed from the presence of the council. This is after this. This is the second time they've been threatened with jail. Their lives have been threatened. They rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for what? For his name. In the Bible, the name stands in place of what? The person, okay? So if you suffer or you preach for the sake of the name of Christ, you're doing it for Christ. That's what John's talking about in 3 John when he says that they're going out for his name's sake. They're workers for Jesus Christ. And you see the same thing all the way through the book of Acts. In fact, look at chapter 9, Acts chapter 9, just as a second reference. Look at verse 15. But the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings and children of Israel. Now this is Ananias who's telling Saul what God had told him. And then verse 16, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake, which would be on my account. Okay, so that language is pretty standard in Scripture, where you use the name of the person in place of the person. So the first reason, John says, you do a good thing if you receive them and then you send them off in a good fashion. You send them off well. You're doing it because, number one, they're doing it for my name's sake. And then go back to 3 John. Here's the second. Verse 7. What's the second reason? They took nothing with them from the Gentiles. So what does it mean to take nothing from the Gentiles? Okay. When Paul, John, worker sent by Paul, worker sent by John, whoever was a worker that was sent or dispatched, Ananias and Aquila and Priscilla rather, anybody that was a worker, and they went to a congregation to help that congregation, if they were receiving from funds, from whom did they not take money? From Gentiles, which means the heathen, the pagan. They were not doing that. They took nothing from the pagans. Why wouldn't they do that? There's probably a couple of reasons. Why wouldn't they, Bobby?
My thought would be so they would not think that all they were after was the money.
Okay. For one reason, how does the church fund its operation? Okay, we have a weekly contribution, do we not? And anything that we are able to participate in that costs us money to do that, it happens because we've been able to contribute that on the first day of the week. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. On the first day of the week, you lay by in stores God has prospered, that there be no collections when I come. And then Paul said, we'll deal with it, that money as need be. But the point is that that's where it comes from. We do not generate money from other places. We don't have bake sales and car washes, and we don't have special Saturday contributions, and we don't solicit money from the public. It comes from us, which the second part is it illustrates that this is not about money. It's not about gaining riches and popularity with the public. It's about just sharing truth, which is funded by the church. And sometimes we will have, we put videos out on, we do live streams every Sunday, and we have live stream on Sunday night, and then we do videos on Wednesday where we have published videos, or we'll do a series or something. And every now and then somebody will say, how can I contribute to this? And I'll say, you don't need to. It's not monetized. We don't get money from this. We're not after kickback money-wise from YouTube when we do things, because it's paid for by the church. Whatever cost is involved is paid for. It's very minimal to do it anyway. But Paul or John is saying, when we sent workers, we didn't have those workers taking money from the Gentiles, because it's not about getting rich or taking money from the world. It's about doing the work of the church, which is funded by the church and workers who are members of the church like Gaius. Yeah, Steve?
Well, again, you wouldn't want the Gentiles to say, well, those Christians over there, they wouldn't make it without us.
Yeah, that's right. And if there were ever an anti-televangelist passage, this is it. Right? This is among those that do that, but this destroys the model of getting on TV and begging folks to send money to fund your programs. Right? This is the anti-Joel Osteen passage, or the many of the other passages where you just get people who get on and they're just begging for money. Send us money, because John says a true worker of the church doesn't do that. It doesn't charge the Gentiles, the heathen, the public to do the work of the church. So he says, therefore, in verse 8, therefore, you ought rather to receive such, which means you've done it in the past, but for these reasons, what should guys keep on doing in the future? Keep on doing it. Keep on doing the right thing. We ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth, which means, as a result of that, if you help faithful members of the church in whatever work they are involved in, where does that put you in the grand scheme of things? As a co-worker. You're part of the work. He says it right here in verse 8. You become a fellow worker for the truth, right? You become a joint participant in spreading the truth, which also means, should we be very careful in who we support? Yes. So couple that with what we talked about like in 2 John. When he says, if somebody comes to you and they do not bring this doctrine, and we said that the best way to understand that is reputation precedes folks, or to ask questions. Are they teaching the truth? How would we know that? Ask them a question. Or what do you believe about this? What do you believe about that? Are you in line with Scripture on this? And if somebody is not teaching the truth, or there's the speculation that they're off on a subject matter, you wouldn't want to support it, because then you would not be a fellow worker in the truth. You become a fellow worker in something else, a fellow worker in error, a participant in error. We have to be really careful who we support. And that, of course, in congregations falls to elderships to filter out people to make sure that whoever we're supporting is worthy of support. Now, there's a lot of principle here, and I think this is super important. I say what we're about to say, we say in principle. I do not want you to think that this is an indictment of this congregation, because you, as a congregation, this is the best I've ever seen at supporting workers of the church and being kind to workers of the church. But it's not always this way, and I want to talk about this in principle. There's a couple of things that are very, very important right here. And this goes to what I just said. Here's the first thing that we get from this. As a congregation or as individuals, we must be discerning about who we support. And according to verse 8, when he says that we may become fellow workers for the truth, who are we only ever allowed to support? People that do what? That are preaching the truth and work for the truth. That's it. We cannot do anything else. Whose primary job, and I hinted at it just a second ago, whose primary job in a congregation is that? Okay, it's the eldership. All right, hold your place. Go to Acts chapter 20, and we're going to start about verse 28. Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. All right, listen to verse 28. Paul's writing to the elders. Now, if you wanted to know if it's the elders, you go back to verse 17. From Miletus, he sent to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church. All right, so he's talking to elders. Verse 28. Therefore, take heed to yourselves. Who are the yourselves there? It's the elders, okay, because that's verse 17. He's talking about the elders. Take heed to yourselves to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit's made you overseers. So if there was a question, we know now he's talking to elders. To shepherd the church of God which he purchased with his blood. So whose job is it to lead each local congregation? Eldership, right? Verse 29, for I know this, that after my departing, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves, men will rise up, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. Therefore watch. So whose job, first and foremost, is it to protect the local church? Okay, it's the eldership's job to do that. Go to the book of Titus. Look at chapter 1. Go to Titus chapter 1. Verse 9. Speaking to elders, if there's a question, you go back in verse 5, appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. If a man is, and then he starts talking about qualifications. Verse 9, of elders, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. That would be contradict the sound doctrine that he knows to be the truth. For there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. So again, who is or what is the first line of defense in a congregation? It's the eldership. It should always be that. It doesn't mean that we ourselves aren't responsible for being aware, but if we consider the qualifications of an eldership, are elders supposed to be men of the book? Yeah, they're supposed to be men of the book who know the book and are willing to stand for the book. So elderships have a responsibility to filter requests that come in. And do you think elders get a lot of requests for support? The mailbox is full. Every day the mailbox is full of requests from all over America and the world asking for financial help. But it's also the congregation's job to be a part of that. Can we always support every request? We cannot do that. Financially, it's not feasible, but also doctrinally. When you consider the volume of requests and the limited funds of a congregation, we have to be discerning about how we go about filling those requests. And a congregation's money, the priority should always be, at least the largest percentage of it, should be its own preservation and growth in its local community. So when you consider that with every request that comes in, you can't always fill every single request for workers who are asking for it. You've got to discern, but the main thing is, whatever we decide to do, you've got to financially, if it's financial support, it has to be in matters of truth, people who are teaching the truth. And look at Philippians chapter 4, just real quick. Philippians chapter 4. In verse 15, this verse has always just stuck as sort of, I think, the litmus test for every single thing that you get involved in. Look at verse 15. Paul's writing to the Philippians. He says, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me." Does anybody have an alternate translation there? Communicated? Anybody else have communicated, shared? Partnership, okay. Communication, sharing, and partnership are all words that fall under what F word? Fellowship. Fellowship. And that's the word here, koinonia. No congregation fellowshipped with me with concerning giving and receiving, but you only. And notice it's in giving and receiving. When we give money to something, when we receive money from something, what is that? It's partnership. It's fellowship, okay? So if we discern, if the elders get a request and somebody says, "We want you to partner with us in this work, this great work that's going on," and they look it up and they find that the congregation that is supporting or overseeing that work has innovations in worship, and they don't even teach baptism anymore, can we be involved in that work? Absolutely not. We cannot be involved in that because you partner with people who are not workers of truth. Truth is what matters. Yes, sir.
Paul said in Ephesians 5:11, "Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but
rather reprove them, expose them." That's exactly right. Okay, so what John says is that we have to be incredibly discerning about who we support. Now, here's the second thing that I think is implied, at least from what John is saying here, and that is that sometimes preachers, teachers, workers of truth, full-time workers or whatever they might be, even part-time workers, sometimes they are abused and mistreated. Now, you're going to see it because in 3 John, while Gaius treated them well, Diotrephes took those workers, and what did Diotrephes do with those folks? He was kicking them out, and anybody that tried to support those folks. But I think it is very clear that sometimes workers are abused or mistreated in the church. Was Paul ever mistreated? Sometimes by brethren. Yeah, sadly it's the case. And it is a fact. We've seen it play out so many times, even in our own history, where people are done that way. And as a preacher, I hear from other preachers how preachers have been treated. And I know for a fact, I know how it is when people owe you money and won't even pay you money for it. I've left a congregation amicably and had a severance package, and they were like, "We're not going to pay that." So, I know what it's like to be out several $1,000s of money. Broken promises and contracts. I know a man who went to a congregation and the promise he was going to do a good work, and they hadn't even told him that they had a several-year plan for closing the congregation. And he gets there and it's like, "What in the world? Why would you not tell me that?" And then he ends up having to leave because they're wanting to close, and he's not wanting to do that. He wants to be a worker for the Lord. I think that's deceiving. It's not right for that to happen. Or where you overwork laborers, you hire a preacher to preach the gospel, and he ends up having to do everything. He's the yard mowing guy, the bulletin printing guy, he's the building cleaning guy, he's everything. And I know preachers who've been stuck in that situation, or where you end up without support, or you get excluded from things, or you're the subject of gossip and ungodly treatment. And what happens is it results in workers in bitterness and hard feelings and hardship. And I know people who quit the ministry or sometimes even leave the church. And John is saying, Gaius, thank you for treating people well. It matters how you treat workers of the church. Now, the third thing that's here is this. Are preachers, teachers, workers in the church, are they worthy of support? Yes, they are. They're worthy of support, as are other laborers in the gospel. So it's not just preachers, but anybody that works in that. Remember when we were studying 1 Timothy, and he gets down in 1 Timothy 5, and he gets to verse 17, and he talks about how elders that rule well are worthy of double honor. And you don't think about it. We don't often think that it's the possibility, but what does he mean by elders that rule well are worthy of double honor? What's that mean? It's possible to pay elders, right? If you could be in a position where you could pay a man or supplement his income so that he could spend more time doing the work as an elder, that's a good thing for a congregation to do. I've only known one or two congregations that have ever done something like that, but that's a great thing when you can help support that. Or maybe help supplement elders to go to lectureships or something to further their education so that they can still be great elders. But generically speaking, here's where we get this from. Look at Galatians 6, and then I want to talk specifically about preachers. Look at Galatians chapter 6. Here's the generic principle for what John is saying in 3 John. Galatians 6. And then we'll talk specifically about preachers, because John sent some workers that guys treated well, and John was thankful for that. So look at verse 6 of Galatians 6. Let him who is taught the word. Now, him who is taught, is that the teacher or the student? All right, that's the student. Let him who is taught, that's the student, taught the word, share. Who's he going to share to? The teacher, the worker, in all good things with him who teaches. What does he mean by that? Well, look at verse 7. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, but he says especially to those who are of the household of faith. Now he's talking about financial support here, and if somebody is involved in the working of the word, they're a teacher, they're giving their time and effort and money, what are they worthy of? Some sort of financial offset to the time and the effort that they put into that. Now, specifically with preachers, it is possible that some preachers choose to be bivocational. Or maybe they just have a vocation, they do the preaching for free. They can be bivocational. In 1 Thessalonians 2 in verse 9, Paul talked about how he worked day and night to prevent taxing the brethren from supporting him. And what did Paul do as a side business? He was a tent maker. So there was a time when Paul sometimes would go and he would help make tents and probably repaired, patched, made tents, sold tents, as a way of generating income so that he wasn't taxable to congregations where maybe they didn't have the ability to support. But are preachers or full-time workers in the church, are they worthy of the support that they give, the time and the effort? Yeah, turn to 1 Corinthians 9. Yeah, Philip, go ahead. That's the passage? All right, look at 1 Corinthians 9. Philip's already one step ahead of me. 1 Corinthians 9. Look at 1 Corinthians 9. There are lots of passages that deal with this. But I know that there are some people who would object to what John was saying. They would say, you don't have to pay people or you don't have to financially support people. And Paul literally says that that's what should happen in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. All right, so start in verse 1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I'm not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. I help convert you, so you're proof of what I have done and the work I've done with you. My defense to those who examine me in this. Do we not have a right to eat and drink? So when you're talking about support, what is the goal, for example, of support for a preacher? What are you supporting? Yeah, Art? Yes, you're supporting his livelihood. So Paul himself had no wife and he had no children, but other people do, and he'll talk about that. Verse 5, do we not have a right to a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, Cephas? So Peter was a man, and Peter would qualify later in 1 Peter 5 as an elder, so he had children. Okay, so men have families, they've got to be taken care of, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, right? Does a soldier just pack his own ammo and he packs his own food. He has the money to do that. And a government funds him to do that. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, right? He reaps what he sows. Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it's written in the law of Moses, the principle is, you'll not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. It is oxen, or is it oxen that God is concerned about? That's the thing he wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Or does he say altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, that it is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Is it too much to ask that men be supported for preaching the truth? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have we have not used this right. It's a preference thing, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. So Paul is making the case that workers should be supported. Now, again, some preachers are bivocational, but I can say as a full-time preacher, I know this to be the case, and that's admirable that some can be. But what happens when you're bivocational usually? Yeah, one thing falls behind, and it's usually the ministry that usually falls behind. One thing you don't give most attention to and focus on the ministry. And if you're doing it right, you don't have time for anything else. You don't have time for anything else. And so they deserve to be supported. Yes, Gene?
In the early church, the elders did a lot of the preaching.
Yes, they did.
And this is proof that after a while, they started dedicating money and support to a pulpit preacher.
Yes, right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, this passage, along with others, would do that. So when John says to Gaius, you've done a good thing, right? These men sent to you testified how you hosted them. Somehow he financially was able to support these men. He sent them off with supplies, and he's saying you did well. But that's the scriptural thing to do, and Gaius did a good thing by that. Diotrephes is just the opposite of that. But I think the fourth thing to learn from what John says in 3 John is in verses 7 and 8. Their success is also our success, but only as truth is taught and God is glorified. So glory is given to God. Prayers are answered, and we are confident in the prayers that are answered, and our confidence is built. Reputations are built. Faith is strengthened. Bonds are made. But I think, and this is where I think you as a congregation, us as a congregation, you do so very, very well. When we bring in men to speak, like we have a visiting preacher. Summer series is coming up really quickly on us. So the month of June, we'll have every Tuesday night, we'll have a special speaker in. When those men go to the back after they've preached their heart out, do you think they feel like they were loved after they've preached the gospel? They tell me that. I know they feel that way because there's not a single person in this room that doesn't stop and tell them how much they appreciate their efforts. It means something to them. And of course the elders pay them and they go on their way, and they have been encouraged by being here, but we've been encouraged by their being here, and we've all been a participant in the truth. So this is such an important section because this doesn't happen a lot of times in some congregations. Preachers, workers of the church are not supported like they should be, but you do a great job of that. And so you're a Gaius as a congregation, and keep it up. That's what John's encouragement is. Keep on doing the right thing. Keep on doing well, and you'll be blessed for that. Now, we're going to dig in next week on this. This is a hard-hitting section. In so many places, it is a temptation for somebody to become the dominant force of that congregation. It is a one-man show in some congregations. And it doesn't have a thing in the world to do with doctrine. I don't think what Diotrephes was doing was doctrine in the sense of what was being taught other than what was being practiced, but he became a one-man show. He wanted it all to be about him. And I don't know what he was. Maybe he was the pulpit preacher, and he didn't like that John was sending workers in. But Diotrephes in verse 9 loved to have the preeminence, to the point that when John sent those workers, he was not even allowing them voice from John. He wasn't even receiving them. And anybody in the congregation that was saying, but they came from John, he was actually trying to expel them from the congregation too. And John's got some pretty stern words of how to deal with preeminent, loving, Diotrephean men in congregations. So we're going to talk about it. And then you've got the contrast to it, which is Demetrius. Demetrius is a faithful man with a good testimony from all, and we'll see how that plays out next week. So thank you very much. Get ready for verses 9 through 12 next week, and maybe we can finish it out and start Amos the week after that. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your input so much. Great discussion today. Appreciate it.